no slave born on Barrow Plantation in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, lived to see their 31st birthday. Not one, not in 1840, not in 1845, not in 1850. The records say so. The ledgers say so. The plantation diary, written in the hand of its owner, says so. And for 140 years, nobody asked why. This is the story of what those records contain, and what they were designed to hide. In 1936, a researcher named Lyle Saxon walked into the Louisiana State University archives and pulled a leather-bound ledger from a box that had not been opened in decades. He was documenting plantation records for the Federal Writers Project, a New Deal initiative, a government effort to preserve American history before it was lost entirely. Saxon was used to old documents. He was used to plantation records. He was not prepared for this one. The ledger belonged to Bennett H. Barrow. Barrow was a cotton planter in Feliciana Parish, not far from the Mississippi state line. He owned Highland Plantation. He owned, at his peak, more than 200 enslaved people. And from 1836 to 1846, he kept a diary. Not just a diary, a record, a document so detailed, so precise, so meticulously maintained, that historians would later call it one of the most complete, first-hand accounts of plantation, slavery in the American South. It was also one of the most damning. Barrow wrote in his diary almost every day. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about the cotton prices. He wrote about the soil. He also wrote about the people he owned. He wrote about their punishments. He wrote about their illnesses. He wrote about their escapes. And he wrote, always, about their deaths. The Barrow Plantation Diary was eventually published in 1943 by Columbia University, edited by historian Edwin Adams Davis, annotated, indexed, made available to scholars. The violence in its pages is extraordinary, but that is not what this story is about. This story is about what lies underneath the violence, what the violence was covering, what Bennett Barrow was, without knowing it, documenting in the margins of his own crimes. In 1984, a medical historian named Todd Savitt published a study. He had spent years cross-referencing plantation records, slave mortality data, and medical accounts from the antebellum South. What he found in documents like the Barrow Diary was a pattern, not an accident, not a coincidence. A pattern. The enslaved people on these plantations were not simply dying young because of brutal conditions alone. They were dying young because of something specific, something that moved through the body over time, something that accelerated under the weight of unrelenting physical labor, something that the planters recorded without understanding, and the enslaved survived long enough to name among themselves, before they too were taken. That something had a name, but it would take another 50 years and the work of 3 different researchers before anyone connected the plantation ledgers to the medical literature. One of the names in the Barrow Diary is Isaac. He appears first in 1837. He is listed as approximately 22 years old. He is described as a field hand, a strong one. By 1841, he is listed as unable to work. By 1842, he is dead. He was 27 years old. The cause of death listed in the ledger is a single word: decline. To understand what happened at Highland Plantation, and at dozens of plantations like it across the Louisiana-Mississippi corridor, you have to understand the world that built them. The 1830s in the American South were a time of extraordinary expansion. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had transformed an already brutal institution into something almost incomprehensible in scale. Cotton was not just a crop, it was the engine of the American economy. By 1860, cotton from the American South accounted for nearly 60% of all U.S. exports. Every bale of that cotton was picked by hand, by enslaved hands, by bodies that were not considered bodies by the law, but were, by the same law, the most valuable property in the country. Bennett H. Barrow was born in 1811 in West Feliciana Parish. He inherited enslaved people. He inherited land. He was, by the standards of his time and place, a man of moderate wealth, who believed without question in the rightness of the world he had been given. He was not, in the historical record, considered unusually cruel. That fact is important, because what the diary reveals was not the product of exceptional cruelty. It was the product of ordinary cruelty, systemic cruelty, the cruelty of a machine operating exactly as it was designed. Barrow's diary entry for March 12, 1840 reads, "Whipped nearly all hands this evening for trashy picking. Have had many Negroes complaining of sickness this winter. Not sick enough to stop work. Not sick enough to stop work." That phrase appears in the diary, in variations, more than 40 times. It tells you everything about the calculus of Highland Plantation. A body that could still stand, could still work. A body that could still work was producing value. The moment it stopped producing value, it became a liability. The moment it became a liability, it entered the ledger under a different column. Dr. Michael Tadman, a British historian who spent decades studying the internal slave trade, calculated in a 1989 study that enslaved people in the Deep South during the 1840s and 1850s died at approximately twice the rate of their counterparts in the Upper South. Not because the Upper South was kind, it was not, but because the labor demands in the Deep South, the cotton, the sugar, the rice, were categorically different. The cotton harvest required a full-body sustained effort for months at a time, stooping, dragging, carrying, from before dawn until after dark, without adequate caloric intake to support that level of exertion, without rest adequate to allow recovery. The body keeps score. That is a phrase from modern trauma medicine, but it applies here in the most literal, physical, cellular sense. Every unrested night, every missed meal, every flogging that left scar tissue where muscle had been, every pregnancy carried through the cotton rows, every infant weaned too early so the mother could return to the field. The body kept score, and in the ledgers of Highland Plantation, that score was written down. Among those names is a woman named Lavinia. She appears in the 1836 inventory of Barrow's enslaved property. She is listed as 18 years old. She is listed as a field hand. She is listed as having one child, a boy named Peter, approximately 2 years old. Lavinia will appear in this diary 4 more times over the next 6 years, each entry shorter than the last. The final entry from October 1842 reads, "Lavinia died in the night, was sickly some weeks, age about 24. Peter is not mentioned again after 1843. He would have been approximately 9 years old. There is no record of what happened to him. That absence, that silence in the ledger, is its own kind of testimony." In 1844, a physician named Samuel Cartwright published a paper in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. The paper was titled, "Report on the Diseases and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race." It was pseudoscience. It was racist propaganda dressed in medical language. It was designed to justify slavery by arguing that black people were physiologically different, suited to servitude, harmed by freedom. Cartwright invented diseases. He invented a condition he called drapetomania, which he defined as the mental illness that caused enslaved people to run away. He was not joking. This was published medical literature. It was cited in legal proceedings. It was used to return escaped people to bondage. But buried inside Cartwright's fabrications was something else, an observation, a real one. He noted, in clinical language without understanding what he was seeing, that enslaved workers in the cotton and sugar fields of Louisiana showed signs of what he called exhaustion of the vital principle at remarkably young ages. He noted accelerated aging, rapid deterioration of joints, chronic lung conditions, what he called failure of the system in people who appeared, by external examination, to be in their 20s. He could not explain it. He did not try very hard. He attributed it to what he called the peculiarities of the race and moved on. But the observation was real. The bodies were real. The accelerated death was real. And Cartwright, in attempting to prove that black people were subhuman, had accidentally documented something that would take medicine another 140 years to fully understand. In 1976, a historian named Richard Such published an analysis of antebellum slave mortality data. He had spent years compiling numbers, death records from plantation ledgers, census mortality schedules, church burial records from plantation parishes. What he found confirmed what the ledgers had been whispering for a century. Enslaved people in the deep South cotton and sugar regions, specifically those engaged in full field labor, showed average life expectancies at birth of approximately 21 to 23 years. 21 years. For comparison, a white male planter in the same region in the same period had a life expectancy at birth of approximately 40 to 45 years. The gap was not poverty. It was not simply disease exposure. Those factors existed, but they did not fully account for the gap. The gap, such argued, was labor. Specifically, the nature, the intensity, and the complete absence of limit placed on the labor extracted from enslaved bodies. He was not wrong, but he also didn't yet have the medical framework to describe exactly what was happening inside those bodies. That framework would come later, from a completely different direction. The framework came from the study of stress physiology. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers studying poverty, trauma, and chronic stress developed a concept they called allostatic load. Allostatic load is the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress on the body. When the body is under threat, physical, psychological, or both, it activates stress response systems, cortisol, adrenaline, inflammatory proteins. These systems are designed for short-term emergencies. Run from the predator, fight the threat, survive the moment. But when those systems are activated continuously, day after day, year after year, they do not protect the body. They consume it. Elevated chronic cortisol degrades muscle tissue. It accelerates cardiovascular aging. It suppresses immune function. It damages kidney function. It accelerates the shortening of telomeres, the protective caps on DNA that determine how quickly a cell ages. A person living under conditions of chronic severe stress, physical labor, physical violence, chronic undernourishment, social terror, complete loss of autonomy, ages faster, not metaphorically, biologically, cellularly. Their body is older than their birth year suggests. In 2006, a team of public health researchers at the University of Michigan published a paper connecting allostatic load research to historical plantation mortality data. They were the first to say in peer-reviewed medical literature what the ledgers had been recording all along. The enslaved people of the American South did not simply die young because of hard conditions. They were biologically aged to death. Their bodies were consumed, deliberately, systematically, by design. In the Barrow diary, there is an entry from June 7, 1841. It reads, "Dennis died, was a likely boy, aged 22 or thereabouts. Worked well up to last month. Sudden decline. Sudden decline." That phrase appears in Plantation, records across Louisiana and Mississippi, more times than anyone has ever counted. Sudden decline. It was not sudden, it never was. Her name was Martha Colquitt. She was born enslaved in Georgia, approximately 1848. She was interviewed in 1936 by a federal Writers Project researcher named Grace McCune. The interview was conducted on a porch, in the summer heat, with a pencil and a notebook and a woman who was, by her own account, nearly 90 years old. Martha Colquitt remembered things. She remembered names. She remembered faces. She remembered the particular sound of a name being called out across a cotton field when someone did not get up. She said, "The ones that died young, that we knew they was going to die, you could see it coming. They'd get thin and then thinner, and then you'd go to work one morning and they wasn't there no more. They wasn't there no more." Martha Colquitt was not unusual. The Federal Writers Project, between 1936 and 1938, collected more than 2,300 interviews with formerly enslaved people across 17 states. The interviewees ranged in age from their late 80s to over 100 years old. They were speaking from memory, from 8-9 decades of lived distance, and across those 2,300 testimonies, in the transcripts now held at the Library of Congress, a pattern emerges. A pattern of remembering the young dead, not the old, not the sick who died of age. The young, the ones who were strong and then suddenly were not. The ones who went quiet over weeks and months and were gone before winter. The ones whose names were still being spoken decades later by people who had watched them disappear. A woman named Harriet Robinson, interviewed in Oklahoma in 1937, said, "Mama lost 3 brothers on the plantation before she was grown, none of them old. She said the work got them. Not a sickness, the work itself. The work itself." A man named Charlie Barber, interviewed in North Carolina in 1937, described watching his father. "Papa was a big, strong man when I was little. By the time I was grown, he was stooped and grey and moved like an old man. He wasn't but 40. He died the next year. The master put in the record he was 50. He was 41. The master put in the record he was 50. This detail, the falsification of ages in plantation records, is not a minor footnote. It is central to understanding what the ledgers actually contain. Historian Dinah Ramey Berry, in her 2017 book The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, documented a consistent pattern. When enslaved people died and their bodies were appraised for estate purposes, a grotesque but legally required process, the ages recorded by appraisers frequently differed from the ages recorded in working ledgers. Bodies that appeared physiologically to be in their 40s and 50s were often, in the testimony of surviving family members, actually in their late 20s and 30s. The bodies looked older than they were. Because the bodies were older than they were, the allostatic aging that researchers in 2006 described in clinical terms, the cellular biological acceleration, was visible to the naked eye. The planters saw it. The appraisers saw it. They wrote the wrong number in the ledger and moved on. Martha Colquitt, in her 1936 interview, said one more thing that the researcher almost didn't write down. She said, "My grandmother used to say, don't let them see you resting. Don't let them see you slow, because the ones they think is failing, those are the ones they work the hardest. To get the last out of them before they go. To get the last out of them before they go." There is a word for this. In economics, it is called asset liquidation. You extract maximum value from a depreciating asset before it reaches zero. The planters knew, not in the language of stress physiology, not in the language of allostatic load, but they knew. They knew the body they were working was failing. They knew the clock was running, and they ran it faster. That is not incidental to the story of American slavery. That is the story. His name was Reuben. He appears in the Barrow Plantation records for the first time in 1836. He is listed as approximately 19 years old. His value is recorded $750. He is listed as a prime field hand. Over the next 7 years, Reuben appears in Barrow's diary 17 times. Most of the entries are brief. Functional, the record of a tool, not a person. Reuben plowed the north field. Reuben hauled timber. Reuben, picking slow, spoke to him about it. Spoke to him about it is plantation diary language. It means he was punished. But there are 2 entries about Reuben that are different from the others. The first is from August 1839. Barrow writes, "Reuben ran off again, 3rd time this year. Found him in the break after 2 days. He has some woman over at the Sterling place. Will not be broken of it. He is a strong hand but troublesome. He has some woman over at the Sterling place. Her name is not recorded. Not in this diary. Not anywhere that has survived. She was a person with a name. She was a person who mattered enough to Reuben that he ran, knowing the consequences, 3 times in a single year to reach her. The consequences for running were documented by Barrow himself. His diary describes his standard punishment for escape attempts, flogging on return, followed by a period in what he called the stocks, followed by a reduction in food rations. Reuben ran anyway 3 times. The second unusual entry about Reuben is from March 1843. Barrow writes, "Reuben took poorly this winter. I feared it was the same decline that took Dennis. He is not what he was. We'll try him on lighter work and see. Not what he was. He was 26 years old, lighter work. In the calculus of Highland Plantation, lighter work meant less value. A body moved to lighter work was a body on the way out. It was the ledger's anteroom. The final mention of Reuben in the Barrow diary is from November 1843. It is 4 words. Reuben died, age 26. 4 words, for a life of 26 years. For 3 escapes, and the woman whose name we'll never know. For the Northfield and the Hall timber. For the floggings recorded in the same handwriting as the 4 words that end him. The Barrow diary was published in 1943. It was reviewed in academic journals. It was assigned in history courses. It is cited in hundreds of scholarly works. Reuben is mentioned in exactly none of them. His 17 appearances in the source document appear in no index, in no footnote, in no analysis. He was there. He is documented. He ran 3 times to reach a woman he loved, and he died at 26, and history walked right past him. This is also the story. The invisibility, not just in life, in the record of life. The way a person can be thoroughly documented, appraised, inventoried, punished, listed, buried, and still remain to the historical record, essentially absent. Reuben is not absent. His name is in the ledger. His body was on that land. His choice to run toward love, knowing what waited on the other side, is one of the most documented acts of resistance in the entire Barrow archive, and it has never, in 80 years of scholarship, been called that. If cotton was brutal, sugar was something else entirely. Sugar cultivation in Louisiana in the 1840s and 1850s was not farming, it was industrial extraction. The sugar harvest, called the grinding season, ran from October through January. During that period, the mills ran 24 hours a day. The enslaved workers ran shifts of up to 20 hours. Some accounts describe workers collapsing at the machinery and being held upright by other workers, so the line would not stop. Dr. Richard Follett, in his 2005 study The Sugar Masters, analyzed mortality data from Louisiana sugar parishes in Terrebonne, St. Mary, and Assumption. His findings were stark. Enslaved people in sugar parishes died at rates significantly higher than those in cotton parishes, which were already catastrophic. Among enslaved men in the peak labor years of 18 to 35, the mortality rate in some sugar parishes exceeded 30% over a 5-year period. 30% in 5 years among healthy young men. Follett also documented what he called the grinding season mortality spike, a measurable increase in deaths among enslaved workers in the months immediately following the sugar harvest. January, February, March. After the grinding stopped, the bodies stopped too. The mechanism, as we now understand it, the sustained extreme exertion of the grinding season pushed the body's stress response systems past their functional limits. Cortisol levels that had been catastrophically elevated for months suddenly dropped. Immune function, suppressed during high cortisol states, attempted to reactivate in a body already compromised, already carrying the accumulated load of years. That reactivation sometimes triggered inflammatory cascades that the body could not survive. They survived the grinding and then died in the quiet after it. A planter named William Minor, whose records are preserved at Louisiana State University, wrote in his Plantation journal in February 1852, "Lost 3 good hands this month, all gone off after grinding. Was unexpected in all cases, as they appeared hearty through the season. Cannot account for it. Cannot account for it. He had run them past the edge of what a human body can survive. They had stayed past that edge long enough to finish his harvest. And then they had died, and he could not account for it. There is a particular horror in that incomprehension, not the horror of cruelty, the horror of a system so normalized, so utterly accepted as the natural order of things, that a man could watch 3 people die in his own fields and experience it as a logistical puzzle, an accounting problem. Among the 3 hands William Minor lost that February, their names are recorded. Sam, Harry, a woman listed only as Old Bess, who, based on Minor's own earlier inventory, was approximately 31 years old. Old Bess, 31 years old. The children saw all of it. Children born into slavery on Deep South plantations did not have childhoods, in any sense that the word typically implies. They worked. Not at first. The very young were sometimes kept together in what planters called the children's house, while their mothers worked the fields, tended by one enslaved woman too old or too sick to be useful elsewhere. But by the age of 7 or 8, they were in the fields. By 10 or 11, they were doing near adult work. By 12, in many cases, they were doing adult work. And they watched. They watched the people around them age. They watched the strong become slow. They watched the slow disappear. A man named Louis Hughes, who was born enslaved in Virginia around 1832 and later published a memoir titled 30 Years a Slave in 1897, wrote about his first years on a Mississippi cotton plantation. I was a boy of perhaps 10 years when I first understood what it meant when a grown man was taken to the sick house. It meant he was done. I never saw one come back from the sick house to the field. Never once in all the years I was there. Never once. The sick house was the end of the road. And the children on that plantation learned this, the way children learn the things adults don't say out loud, by watching, by counting, by keeping their own internal ledger. Louis Hughes was eventually moved to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He describes the grinding season with a precision that no outside observer could have achieved. He describes the sound of the mill, the heat, the way time stopped mattering when the grinding ran through the night. The darkness outside the windows was the same as the darkness inside the workers, an absence of anything except the work and the sound of the machinery, and the knowledge that it would not stop. He describes a man named Frank. Frank was, by Hughes's account, the strongest worker on the plantation. The one the overseer used as a standard. If Frank was falling behind, something was wrong. During the grinding season of 1856, Frank fell behind. The overseer drove him harder. The planter was called. Frank was given extra rations, a temporary measure, a tune-up for a machine showing signs of wear. Frank finished the grinding season. He died in February 1857, Louis. Hughes wrote, Frank was not yet 30 years of age. He looked 60. His hands were like wood. He told me some weeks before he died that he could feel himself going from inside, that something was running out of him that would not come back. I believed him. I had seen it before. The children of these plantations were educated in an institution that no school could teach and no book could contain. They learned the stages of a life being consumed. They learned to recognize the early signs, the slight change in how a person moved, the way the light left the eyes by degrees, the increasing quietness that came before the final quiet. They learned because they had to, because knowing meant preparing, because preparing was the only form of care that the system could not entirely prevent. The Federal Writers Project interviews are full of this knowledge. A woman named Hannah Crasson, interviewed in North Carolina in 1937, was born around 1850. She said, Mama taught me how to know when a person was going. She said, look at their eyes. If the whites had gone yellow, they didn't have long. She knew how to tell. She'd been watching people go since she was a little girl. Said her mama taught her the same way. Generation to generation, the knowledge passed down, not written, not in any ledger. Carried in the body, in the voice, in the specific instruction of a mother to a daughter, standing in the dirt between cotton rows, learning how to watch someone die. This is what the planters did not record, not because they didn't know it was happening, but because it had no value to them. The grief had no column. The knowledge had no price. The mothers teaching their daughters had no entry in the ledger. But it happened. It happened every generation, on every plantation, in every parish. An entire parallel civilization of grief and knowledge and care, operating in the shadow of the one that owned them, invisible to the record. Real as the earth they worked. The Civil War ended in 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in December of that year. 4 million people were freed, and then almost nothing changed. The planters kept the land. The freed people, with no land, no capital, no legal infrastructure to protect them, were forced back onto the same soil under sharecropping arrangements. That functioned in the daily reality of labor and debt, almost identically to the system that had just been abolished. The same fields, the same work, the same hours, the same bodies, The ledgers changed format. The columns were renamed. The people in them remained. Bennett H. Barrow did not live to see emancipation. He died in 1854. His plantation passed to his heirs. Highland Plantation continued operating through the war and beyond. The records thin after the 1850s. The ledgers do not continue in the same meticulous form, but the land remained, and the people who had worked it, or their children, or their grandchildren, remained on it. Different column, same account. No one was ever tried for what happened on Highland Plantation. Not Bennett Barrow, not his overseers whose names appear in the diary administering punishments, not the appraisers who wrote false ages in the death records, not the physicians like Cartwright who provided the intellectual scaffolding for the system. No inquiry was ever opened. No compensation was ever offered. No memorial was ever built. Isaac, who died at 27. Lavinia, who died at 24. Dennis, the likely boy who was 22. Reuben, who ran 3 times to reach a woman he loved and died at 26. Frank, whose hands had become like wood, who felt himself going from inside. The woman over at the Sterling place, who has no name in any record that has survived. None of them received justice. Not in their lifetimes. Not in the lifetimes of their children. Not in any courtroom, any commission, any legislation. In the 160 years since the system that consumed them was nominally ended. In 2022, a research team at Princeton published a paper in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior. They studied the present day, descendants of people enslaved in the Deep South, cotton and sugar parishes. They measured allostatic load markers, cortisol patterns, inflammatory indicators, telomere length, in a cohort of Black Americans whose genealogical records traced directly to antebellum plantation workers in Louisiana and Mississippi. They found elevated allostatic load markers compared to control groups. They found patterns of accelerated biological aging that could not be fully accounted for by current-day socioeconomic conditions alone. The body keeps score across generations in the cellular memory of people who never stood in a cotton field, never heard a grinding mill, never watched someone go quiet in the night. The account opened in those plantations has not been closed. The ledger is still running. After emancipation, something happened that the planters had never anticipated. The freed people named themselves. For the entirety of their enslavement, they had been denied surnames. A surname implies connection to family, to lineage, to the right to exist in time. They had been denied that right as a matter of policy. After 1865, they took it back. Across the American South, formerly enslaved people registered surnames. With the Freedmen's Bureau, with county clerks, with churches. Some chose the names of former enslavers, not out of sentiment, but as a practical matter of legal continuity, a way of establishing a documented history in a world that had deliberately left them without one. But many chose differently. They chose names that meant something. In the Freedmen's Bureau records for West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, the parish where Highland Plantation sat, there are registrations from 1865 and 1866. Among them, a man who registered as Isaac. Freeman, a man named Dennis. Washington, a woman named Lavinia Truitt. Whether these are the same Isaac, Dennis, Lavinia, who died in Barrow's diary, that cannot be established. The overlap in names may be coincidence. The records are incomplete. The connections cannot be proven. But across those Freedmen's Bureau rolls, across the full archive of post-emancipation name registrations, something is clear. The names chosen most frequently, as documented by historian Ira Berlin in Slaves No More, were names of aspiration. Freeman, Justice, Liberty, Washington. Names that said, I was here. I survived. I am now something this system told me I could never be. The ledgers of Highland Plantation recorded 217 deaths between 1836 and 1861. Of those, the median age at death was 24 years. The Freedmen's Bureau rolls for the same parish, compiled in 1865, list 312 surviving individuals. Some of those 312 had been on that land for 30 years, had watched everyone around them die young, had outlived the system in body if not entirely in mind. They registered. They named themselves. They looked at the clerk with whatever expression they carried, and they said their name. We do not know what it cost them. To still be alive, we do not know what it cost them. To watch what happened to everyone who was not. We do not know the particular weight of having survived a machine that was designed to consume you, and having, by some combination of constitution and fortune and will, not been fully consumed. We know only that they were there, and that they named themselves, and that the names they chose were not the names written in the ledger columns. The ledger called them property. They called themselves free. There is a field in West Feliciana Parish where Highland Plantation once stood. The big house is gone. The mill is gone. The slave quarters are gone. There is no marker, no sign, no official acknowledgement of what happened there. In that field there are depressions in the earth, small, regular, in rows. An archaeologist who surveyed the land in 2009 identified them as grave markers. Fieldstone, mostly sunk below the surface now. Some moved by ploughing, some moved by time. The number of depressions, more than 200. In a field with no name, in a parish where the ledger recorded their deaths, and the world moved on and left them exactly where they fell. Their names are in the ledger. Some of them, the ones Barrow bothered to write down, the ones whose deaths were notable enough to merit ink. But a ledger is not a memorial. A ledger is a record of value, and these were people whose value was measured in dollars per pound of cotton, and acres plowed and barrels of sugar, and the particular efficiency of their dying. How much they gave before they stopped giving. That is not what they were. Isaac ran to a woman he loved. Reuben ran 3 times. Lavinia carried a child into the rows. Dennis was called likely, which means promising, which means someone somewhere saw something in him. Worth that word. Frank felt himself going from inside and told someone. Martha Colquitt lived to 90 and remembered their faces. Hannah Crassen's mother taught her to watch the eyes. They were not what the ledger said they were. They were people, with names chosen for them, and names they chose for themselves, and a before and an after, and a body that kept the score, even when the record would not. The ledger closed in 1861. The land is still there, and underneath it,